Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where every voice matters. You know, with the signing and the implementation now of the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement, a new era of economic relations has dawned on the three amigos. And yet, challenges remain for Canada and U.S. relations and for the Canadian economy. And nowhere is that underlined more than with the province of Alberta, where oil and gas issues, agricultural issues, critical minerals, and other issues are hotspots. And so joining us today is Mr. James Rajotte, who was recently appointed by the Premier of Alberta as the senior representative for Alberta to the U.S. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Prior to this appointment, Mr. Rajotte served in Canada's Parliament for the Edmonton-Strathcona riding from the years 2004 to 2015. James Rajotte, thank you for joining us here today.
Thanks, Tony. Good to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you from Washington, D.C. Tell us, I know this is almost a brand new appointment that Premier Kenney announced. Tell us what your goals are as the special representative in Washington.
Well, you're right. It's a very new appointment. I started this role on May 1st. It's a very interesting time to start a new position, especially down here. In terms of our goals, obviously you mentioned the trade agreement, the recent trade agreement between Canada, U.S., and Mexico. Obviously, the amount of trade that goes between our two countries, between the province of Alberta and the United States, is massive. It leads to strong economic ties on both sides of the border. So we obviously want to see that continue. We're very pleased to see the July 1st in terms of implementation moving forward. We think the trade will continue to go across the border. In fact, even during the pandemic time, we've seen most goods be able to cross the border without too much interruption. So that's certainly a positive sign. We're always watching on the trade side these perennial issues like softwood lumber, country of origin labeling, any Buy American provisions. You always hear some rhetoric at that, both at the national and state level. So we're watching that very closely. But I would say, our interests in terms of economic are very much focused on the energy sector. Obviously, in terms of energy infrastructure, there's some huge projects there that we're trying to advance as best we can in the policy environment down here, both politically, legally, regulatory environment. So that's very much the focus that I'll be expected to put most of my attention to in the coming weeks and months ahead.
Kind of a strange time, of course, because you've got the COVID lockdown. I understand that face masks are once again required in Washington, D.C. And at the same time, you've got the inevitable looking over the shoulder situation politically because you've got national elections coming up, not only for the presidency, but of course for Congress as well. How does that make things a bit more challenging?
It's very challenging. You're absolutely right. Just think of all the juxtaposition of the various things going on. First of all, you've got the pandemic, and as you've seen, there's some numbers creep up in some of the various states. Here in DC, you're right, people wearing masks very much. Some of the restaurants are starting to open, more so in terms of outside on their patios, but now inside they're starting to open, but masks are very common here. So you've got that issue. You've got the whole economic recovery, economic opening issue. You've got obviously the whole social justice issues dealing with Black Lives Matter. That is very prominent and very forefront of all discussions here in the United States. And then, as you mentioned, it's an election year. So that's very much heating up. You've got the presidential election, and then you have the congressional election. So you have a third of the Senate, and then you have the entire House of Representatives up. So to try to sort of advance your issues, that sort of presents a very challenging environment to ensure that we can get our issues on the table for American policymakers at this time.
Indeed, and I want to drill down a little bit, pardon the pun, in terms of the oil and gas sector. I think we'll do that after the break. We'll take our break now so we can have a really full discussion on oil and gas and the future of that given the American political context. So please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. With us today is Mr. James Rajotte, who is Alberta's special representative for the United States, and he is joining us from Washington, D.C. James, thank you again for joining us here today.
Thanks, Tony. Great to be with you.
Wanted to talk about the oil and gas sector. Obviously, there's been so many challenges for that sector over the last couple of years, and then right at the start of COVID, we had the tussle between two great powers, Russia and Saudi Arabia, on oil prices. What do you see as your short-term and long-term goals for the province of Alberta in Washington, D.C. on oil and gas?
On oil and gas specifically, yeah, I mean, if you look at when came into this role, I mean, where oil was trading, obviously we've had some real challenges in that sector on a price side since 2014. You've seen a lot of consolidation in the sector, so companies have really sort of pared down and cut down to many of the costs they can over the last number of years. And then you add in the price war that occurred between Russia and Saudi Arabia. That seems to have resolved itself. So we've seen price rise over the last number of weeks and months, which is a positive sign. But the big challenge for us, I think, as you know, is on the infrastructure side is sort of market access issues. And so we've got pipelines that are very important to us, Keystone XL, Line 3, Line 5, and I put in there the Trans Mountain one going out to Vancouver and Burnaby as well in that mix. They're all going through the various regulatory political stages. You know, obviously Keystone XL, the government of Alberta made a very sizable equity investment, and so that's very top of mind for us. And you know, our argument is that this is something that is, if you look at ESG is very popular, environment, social, and governance. I mean, Canada and Alberta do very well, rank very highly. The Gulf Coast refineries need heavy crude. They're going to get it from somewhere, some way. So they're either going to get it by rail or they're going to get it from other countries. They should get it from the best producer, which is Canada, we would argue, and in the best way by pipeline, in the safest, most environmentally responsible way. So that's our argument to all the policymakers down here. Again, we're very slowly sort of moving through the various political, legal, regulatory processes and all those issues.
It must be challenging because, of course, you do face a very robust sector of environmentalists and who have targeted the province of Alberta for the last number of years. So is there a lot of ground to be made up in terms of putting a sort of a contrary argument that the oil and gas extraction can take place in an environmentally sensitive way?
That's exactly what we have to do. And I think we have been doing it, but we have to continue to do that, which is argue in terms of emissions per barrel, in terms of the research and the innovation, in terms of our own province's environmental plan with respect to reducing emissions, in terms of the collaboration on the research side, setting up COSIA, in terms of sharing massive innovations in order to reduce these emissions. We're doing some very unique things in Alberta. As well, we would say on the carbon capture and utilization side, we now have the carbon trunk line in Alberta. We have a lot of these things which are very innovative in terms of how you capture carbon and put it to other uses, not just use it for enhanced oil recovery, but look at some of the other uses that we can put it towards as well. And these are things where we can really facilitate conversations right across the US, obviously in states that are importers of ours, but you know, I had a conversation yesterday with all the consulates in the New York region to talk about investment. And again, they're very focused on ESG. But I think we as Albertans have a very good story to tell. We now have a natural gas strategy. We recently announced some investments in some very innovative companies on the clean tech side, again, focused very much on carbon utilization. So there's actually a lot of very good conversations. And we have to present that whole holistic Alberta energy story saying, yes, oil and gas is massive. But these companies, in fact, are very broad. So Enbridge is, sure, a pipeline company, but very active on the wind side on renewable, as are a lot of the companies that are in oil and gas. Suncor, very heavily on renewable energy as well, renewable fuels. You look at companies like Capital Power on both sides of the border, what they're doing on renewables, natural gas, and carbon utilization. So very exciting things, even water management. I know I keep going on, but EPCOR and water management, which is very important to states like California, Arizona. Those are conversations and roles that Alberta can really play a big role in.
Hold that thought. We're going to continue with this very important and interesting conversation with Mr. James Rajotte, who is the Alberta Special Representative, Senior Representative in Washington, D.C. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. My guest today is Mr. James Rajotte from Washington, D.C., talking about all things Canada and U.S. James, thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Tony. Appreciate it.
Just want to close off on the oil and gas sector. I've heard made mention, I don't know whether it's aspirational or there's something to this, about now that the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement is signed, that we look to a kind of a Canada-U.S.-Mexico oil and gas, I wouldn't say cartel, but at least understanding and agreement. Have you heard about this story as well?
Well, it's something in terms of having a North American energy strategy. That is something the province and Canada as a country would support very strongly. We want policymakers, sure, with our Mexican neighbors as well, but especially with our American policymakers, to understand if they take any action vis-a-vis what we would call OPEC plus or Russia, that they see when they talk about American supply, that they talk about it in a North American context, understand the integrated nature. I mean, in terms of, we export the most to them, we actually import the most from them as well. So that relationship between Canada and the United States is essential from a North American energy supply context. In terms of both security, we would argue, and in terms of affordability, both of which will be increasingly important as we pull out of this pandemic period.
James, you had a previous political career. You were a member of Parliament for the Edmonton region from 2004 to 2015, and you were chair of the Finance Committee of the House of Commons in that period of time. How do the skill sets that you created for yourself or that you learned, how are they applicable to your new role?
Well, that very much apply, and chairing the Finance Committee from 2008 to 2015. I mean, in that role, dealing with the financial crisis as you did in cabinet and I did from the chairmanship role, and then chairing the Industry, Science, and Technology Committee before. And we used to regularly interface with our American policymakers, both at the congressional level, administration level, Treasury Department, and then deal with the investment communities out of New York. The Finance Committee used to go down there on annual visits. I was also a member of the Canada-U.S. Interparliamentary Group. And as you know, Tony, in the U.S., a very different system in terms of, the power of the executive and the legislative branch, in terms of how they interface. And there's really 535 different power brokers on Capitol Hill, right nearby here. And you really have to understand, who's the chair of, say, the subcommittee on financial services, or who's the undersecretary of energy. And you really have to make sure that you're talking to as many policymakers as possible, because power is much more diffuse here. There's more independent power brokers, and you have to reach them all. So it's a bigger job. Very interesting dynamic, though, as you know. And so coming down here as a chair, it's interesting coming down as a Canadian parliamentarian. You'd see I'm chair of the Finance Committee. You're sort of, first of all, they expect you to be 75 years old, because to get to that point here, you're often very senior in age. But they would often sort of, I think, misunderstand in the Canadian context, think that that's actually higher than a cabinet minister. But it's very much having that political background is a huge asset here. And frankly, they put it in a very basic way. They love saying, I love talking to someone who's just had to knock on a door, a few doors over 5 or 6 elections. That's it just sort of does that common bond between you and the legislatures down here.
Sure. So tell me a little bit about your first impressions then. You've been there for a few weeks. What have you learned, or what have you noticed so far?
Well, as we discussed earlier, with you got the pandemic, the social justice issues, and it's a very, very political environment. That may seem so obvious to say, but everything is political. Even things like masks have become political and partisan in a way that perhaps they would not have leading up to an election. So there you have to make your arguments, and you have to make your points. You have to make them to both parties, and you have to make them to the executive and legislative branches. Senate and the House, but you want to make sure you don't want to become a ping pong in the political arena. You do not want Republicans or Democrats, either party, to see you as favoring one or the other. So you want to make your points to both, and we are. We're being very respectful of that. And we want to make the argument that, in terms of priority issues, these are our priority issues. These should be, to your earlier point about a North American energy supply, these are very much in respond to your constituents and your district in terms of energy security, energy affordability. You have to make that argument. As a member of parliament and a member of provincial parliament for many years, it has to make sense to people back home in our ridings. It has to make sense to people in their districts. So those are the arguments we have to make. Obviously, a challenging environment because most of the meetings are done by phone, Zoom, but that's simply the environment we're living in, and that's we just have to keep sort of live with that and move ahead and keep advancing our issues as best we can.
Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum. We're here with Mr. James Rajotte, who is Alberta's senior representative in Washington, D.C. James, thanks again for being here.
Tony, thanks for having me.
Just want to talk a little bit about, it's great to have you. I just want to talk a little bit about the context again, because of course, it's not just about Canada, U.S. or Alberta, U.S. There is a geopolitical context. And I'm wondering whether in your discussions to date, the issue of China has come up and specifically the decoupling strategy to get our supply chain in North America to be more robust and away from the Chinese supply chain. Is that an issue that you have been discussing?
It is an issue. It's certainly something that is, that American policymakers are very aware of, as you know, they are in Canada as well, because of the intersections we've had with the Chinese government. Obviously, in terms of the Canadians who are in China, the Huawei case up in Canada, but from a supply point of view, it's very high on the president's agenda. His Peter Navarro and his administration is very active on this file. I think to your point, there is, and the pandemic has raised in terms of supply chain issues is how dependent, frankly, North America is on China, and to what extent is that a good thing, and to what extent should many of these supply chains be brought into a North American context. And you see that with personal protective equipment, you see that with medications. But I think you're seeing, and this is likely where you're going, and I think an area you've done a lot of work on is the critical minerals piece. And so that is something the Canadian and U.S. governments have signed a memorandum of understanding. They're both doing work on it on both sides of the border. And a number of the provinces, Alberta is developing its own strategy. I know Ontario and Quebec are very active on this file as well. So this is something that I think you'll see more and more discussions going forward on that critical minerals piece and how we can work together in a North American context.
I know Senator Rubio, as an example, has been very outspoken on critical minerals, saying it's important not only for the U.S. defense sector, but even for environmental issues. If you want to have the right batteries and the right solar panels, you've got to have access to the minerals that make those possible. Can't all be cornered by China. So might be an opportunity for Canada and for Alberta to be part of a discussion about environmental matters with the U.S. that makes sense. Is that part of the strategy you're pursuing?
I think absolutely, in terms of environmental, in terms of national security, as you mentioned, I would, telecommunications that may be linked within national security or may even be separate as a standalone. But all of those areas, it makes sense to have critical mineral supply in terms of environmental standards. And again, ESG has become very large in terms of where institutions, companies want to invest. In terms of the standards, in North America, Canada, United States, or in other countries where a lot of these critical minerals are being expropriated and processed and manufactured. The standards here obviously are very different and of the highest standards, and that's what I think we would expect. And so there is definitely a link to the whole environmental movement and concerns that we can make with respect to critical minerals for sure.
Our time is fleeting and is unfortunately at an end. I want to thank again personally Mr. James Rajotte, who is Alberta's senior representative to the U.S., stationed in Washington, D.C., for being part of this program. Would love to have you back as you get more settled into your role, and certainly the issues are not going to go away. Thank you for being here.
Thanks very much, Tony. Enjoyed it very much, and hopefully I look forward to seeing you down here in DC once the pandemic settles down.
Would be nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to speak today with James Rajotte, who's Alberta's special representative, senior representative in Washington, D.C., former member of Parliament in the Canadian Parliament as well. As you can see, a lot of the issues intersect, not only between Alberta and the U.S., but the broader Canadian perspective, whether it's on oil and gas or critical minerals, or indeed manufacturing or financial services. So having another diplomat in Washington, D.C., representing the province of Alberta, but of course advancing Canadian interests, is to our advantage. We're gonna get back to James Rajotte probably later on in his mandate, because the issues are not going to go away, and certainly after the U.S. election cycle, there's going to be a lot to do in Washington, D.C. So stay here at Boom and Bust as we continue to track these stories. Thank you for watching.